Do 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 do. Extras.
So the vision in which they had been trapped turned out to be an anti-cliffhanger. They regained awareness close to where they had zoned out, the darkness was gone, and all they were left with was an uneasy feeling, and some doom charges, which reduced the effect of their healing, and would be annoyingly expensive to get rid of with decursing spells. There was some typical dungeoneering second-guessing fun as they dealt with the bridge and the runes, and, of course, more of my anti-find-the-path dungeon design, which isn't really anti-FTP so much as just making them work a little, and making the dungeon ludicrously unintuitive, which I also like because you can imagine a less well-endowed party of adventurers being lost and totally screwed. I did, it turns out, not describe properly what lay beyond the door that Little One had smashed. It was unclear from my audio notes, and I only remembered in broad strokes. Had I listened a little further into the next session, I explained it much better there. After he smashed the door, the water should have continued to flow down the hall, although with much less force after the initial blowout. The river flowing down between the two doors should actually have stopped right at the level of the hall, meaning there must be another path for it up higher somewhere. What actually happened was, when the 5-point rune was activated, the river flow was cut off above the two doors, and the stone floor below the doors shifted, releasing any water left in the system. The situation now is that both doors slid open, and the now empty water shaft has just a metal grate across it to walk on. Given the very real possibility of a flying player discovering the anti-flight runes under the bridge the hard way, or that some falling may be involved in the flightless vertical combat that was likely to ensue, I had to have a plan for handling it. I may have been a little off drawing them on the map for the video, though I'm quite happy with how it came out, but the web strands are supposed to start about 80 feet beneath the upper bridge, 20 feet above the lower one. If you fell from higher up, I abstracted the situation using a DC 28 reflex save. That's a very high difficulty because it isn't pass-fail. Rather, making a save meant catching the first, highest web beneath you. For every 2 points by which you failed, you'd fall another 20 feet before managing to catch one. With the sheet web roughly 100 feet below the lower bridge, a save roll of 18 would be enough not to hit bottom, if you started high up. If you start lower down, you have less distance, less time, to avoid hitting the sticky webs. But though far from instant death, landing in the soft sticky net would have been a pretty terrible situation, even if it did cushion the falling damage to a mere 2d6. You'd be alive, but entangled, in magical darkness, with a number of gargantuan spiders looking to suck out your juice. On the plus side, the mistress would be much less inclined to waste spells on you if you presented that way, as normal prey. As discussed by the players in this episode, the general D&D rules for falling came up a lot. Basically, falling damage is capped at 20d6 terminal velocity, and as they are finding, high-level characters with magical constitution bonuses can pretty easily reach a point where, at full health, a fall literally can't kill them. Technically, there are rules for death from massive damage, so that when you take 50 plus damage from a single spell or attack, you have to make a DC 15 fortitude save or die. But we haven't been using that because it mostly just seems to punish characters with lower fortitude. At this point, every PC except Angel could automatically pass that unless they roll a 1. Though, I suppose we could implement it as a modified upping the stakes rule, where whenever you take 50 plus damage from a single spell or attack, but regardless of the mix of damage types, you roll a d20, and on a 1, you die. Given Little One pretty strongly felt that falling should be more dangerous, potentially lethal, I should actually implement that version to make combats a little more tense. I could make them roll it on my boss die for effect. Continuing the saga of the viewpoint character's life in the crapsack world that is most of the Shadowfell, we see that he or she, it's implied to be a he by my voice acting, but gender not relevant here, they have moved up quite a bit, picking up enough necromantic power to kill or drive off all the drow elves who had enslaved his childhood village. Which is interesting, that all that torment under Ralph, and he was just a collaborator, perhaps kicking down to feel better about his own shitty life. I made this vision manageable animation-wise by showing just the narrow sliver of the village that could be seen from the door of the hut, though it's matched up with the finished ditch, moat, whatever that the children were digging so long ago. I cut down the group of villagers that came to talk to just one faceless, blurry person with the shaman. For the end segment moving to the woods, I could reuse some of the tree motion, but there was a new threat to my getting it done. Hands. Many an artist wannabe has been thwarted by hands, and I'm no different. I made a pretty good skeletal hand in a couple positions. That wasn't so bad, but the normal hand in first person, at a weird perspective as he gestured with an open hand, took a bunch of time and still looks bad. To the point that I have two versions, one with palm up, one with palm down, and you can barely tell the difference. And I'm sure nobody could tell just from watching normally. Moving on. There was one shot that would have pushed me too far, though, and that's the 270-degree gore shot. I knew right away this would be very hard to achieve first person. The closer your point of view, the worse the skeleton would look, despite being, I think, a pretty nice cartoon skeleton from a distance. And I knew from a quick planning session it would be very difficult to convey the neat 270-degree burst from a first-person point of view. The way it was done, it was a pretty quick shot to construct, and had quite an impact, so I am happy with it. But I simultaneously dislike having to break from first person, because conceptually it weakens the whole experience. Though, of course, when I cut out to the players commenting or discussing, that clearly breaks the immersion as much or more. Speaking of which, the first vision was pretty static. The players liked it, I think, because it was novel, unnerving, and visceral. But theoretically, I don't want to keep tying them up in long stretches of narration without any agency, even if loss of agency is supposed to be part of the experience. So this time, I tried sort of a mini-game of letting them each make choices in the vision, independently of one another, by letting them try their own dialogue. But it was all kind of weird. I think I needed to be more clear about who got a bonus or a penalty after each try, so they could intelligently deduce that the objective was, in fact, to get as close as possible to the way the actual memory had proceeded. Absent that, they were guessing blindly. Ultimately, it wasn't a bad try to keep them involved, but it wasn't all that good either, so if there were another vision, I would not try that again. There is some interesting subtext in this vision, lore-wise. The protagonist references that losing his arm spurred him to cross a line that he had previously shied away from, that the ritual by which he grafted the skeletal arm granted him even more power. Some of you who know a lot of obscure 3.5 edition stuff might realize that I had the Pale Master necromantic prestige class in mind from Libris Mortis. It was just based on memory. The abilities and level range may or may not make sense, but that was definitely the right feel. At least one viewer noticed they still refer to the Spider Empire from early Drow history, which means this happened a very long time ago. It is probably still after Lolth was destroyed by Delvash, because the Empress managed to keep her theocracy alive for centuries after that, built atop a veritable mountain of lies. But the way they discuss their plans, it sounds like the Vampire Kings have not yet expanded their grasp over the entire continent, and clearly the Drow slavers had a significant surface presence. It also sounds like the Shadowfell has a bit of a Walking Dead thing going on, where after a period of time, the dead rise up as uncontrolled undead, or at least sometimes they do. And we learned that the shaman has a ritual to purify or consecrate corpses to prevent this, which is frankly a pretty common idea for some areas of Earth in medieval times. Spiders. The first thing about this encounter, hitting them as they woke up from the visions, is that I rolled randomly which party member would get webbed the round before most of them woke up. So I randomly rolled Angel, and in hindsight, I really should have re-rolled. It would have been so much cooler, rewarding her better for making all her saves, and it would have been a cool scene. Instead of telling everyone they were waking up, I could have just told Angel, you wake up, you see the rest of the party standing still, their eyes open, but nobody's home, including Person, as you see a big white glob hit them, attached to a thick web cable stretching back to the entrance of the room, where the entire doorway is occupied by the head of a massive spider. What do? Listen to that. 20 times cooler for Angel, more tense for everyone else. I'm not as good a DM as many of you claim, but I am the master of hindsight. But anyway, she did get to slip out, like a boss. That wasn't as fun, but it was a good opportunity to show off her escape artist tech. Poor Daggerface. He really wanted to be more active, but The first time he popped out of the room, with a horrendous spider right near him fighting Little One, another one clearly lurking unseen below Draven and making the rope a dangerous climb, it didn't take that much to dissuade him from getting involved. One thing he had learned from his time in Bankton is that in all the adventure tales and fiction books written by non-dwarves, the dwarf always gets eaten first. You could tell, looking at those huge maws and pedipalps, a few of those tales were running through his head. He may have advanced a lot since they first traveled with him, but his build is not all that optimized. He's kind of all over the place with his class levels, and if they had decided things by a 1v1 duel with Liz, he had considerably less chance of winning than Little One had to have beaten Marp back in those early days of the campaign. On the plus side, the Doom charges are specifically positive energy resistance, whereas DDF's healing aura actually grants fast healing, which is not technically positive energy, as cure spells and other healing magic are, so it's unaffected. The darkness is created by an Unhallow spell, one of the powers granted by the Mistress's half-fiendish template. That's a 5th level spell that lasts a whole year, though it's replicating a lower level spell. There's a list to choose from, but the spiders with their tremor sense like the darkness. Interestingly, this does mean this darkness is effectively cast at level 5, so the arcane version of Blistering Radiance, which is only level 4, would not have been high enough level to get rid of it. Light spells counter darkness spells of equal or lower level, and vice versa. I interpret that as the most recent one wins out. Unfortunately for our half-fiendish spider, Unhallow has a cast time of 24 hours, so she couldn't exactly use it to turn the tables and beat out Black Spell. Now, these spiders were gargantuan. Theoretically, they should have had gargantuan damage reduction by my rules, which would have made them a lot tougher, and practically, if not technically, immune to, say, Daggerface. But I ended up not giving it to them because it didn't feel right. These aren't even tarantulas. They're spindly-looking Black Widow-type spiders. The regular ones in particular are like a huge monster with gargantuan legs. They deserve to be gargantuan for their hit dice, and obviously they have the reach, but those skinny legs, it would have been fine, but my gut said they shouldn't be as tough as, say, Mr. Scorpion or an old gargantuan dragon. The Mistress would have made more sense, being half-fiendish gives her claw attacks that a spider normally wouldn't have, which required her front legs to have a lot more structure and muscle. But I, wrongly, thought that she had enough defenses already. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with the rule. Her crazy defenses were all against spells. I already didn't count the DR 10/magic as anything by, level 8, if not earlier. It would have made the fight harder, would have made the basic spiders a lot more threatening, but it would have been fine. This party has all their crazy artificing gear, they can handle a lot. The Patreon questions. William Bailey asked, how does the Shadowfell work? Where do those endless hordes of undead come from? Are they naturally occurring constructs of negative energy, and a new crop of shambling lesser undead rise up from the ground every so often? Or did this other dimension have its own zombie apocalypse where the millions of humanoids died to a plague and were reanimated? If an army of paladins spent a week butchering every low-level undead they could find, would that actually have any major effect? Or would the undead all be replaced in very short order? As I mentioned in some extras video, I wouldn't bother hunting for it. The info was mostly just nobody knows. The ground of the Shadowfell seems to yield countless bodies, the source of which is mysterious. In-world crazy theories include every time somebody dies in the Fatelands, a corpse appears in the ground of the Shadowfell, though there are a lot of problems with that theory. Others think they're just spontaneously generated by the plane. Meanwhile, as implied in episode 47's vision, there seems to be some kind of Walking Dead effect that anyone who dies in the Shadowfell has at least a chance of spontaneously raising as uncontrolled undead. It's basically one line of the vision, so we can't tell how long it takes, or whether it's 100% of those who die, etc. Probably that's related, but not necessarily. There is some reason to believe that the Vampire Kings, or their servants more likely, raise tons of basic undead in areas to help control territory. They aren't literally everywhere across the surface of the plane. But that just gets back to the question of why there are so many corpses available to raise. Xylem asked, I'd like to hear about architecture and fortification in the Shadowfell and Feywild, which must be really weird. For example, in the Shadowfell, all surface buildings should be about 1 story tall, and you could build a wall right up to the ceiling of the world and be safe from projectile attacks. So how do you construct a higher building in the Shadowfell? Are people digging a deep hole and building from there? And you have a different problem with high buildings in the Feywild. You can build up, sure, but there's no bedrock to attach the foundations to. On the other hand, the infinitely strong floor will support any mass, so you could build huge pyramids. Construction definitely has to take the planar differences into account. For example, Heidelag Castle, the wide Shadowfell fortress with lights and many windows I show sometimes, it's where Zahir was kept before Swain moved him to Mount Pillar. That fortress is well over 20 feet tall, and was built on a wide hill, further accentuating its height. They built the walls right up to the ceiling to prevent ranged attacks, just as you say, and to block flying attackers. But over the centuries, the ceiling keeps adjusting upwards, so they keep having to fill in the gaps, first with stop gaps, which over time they replace with real solid construction, forcing the plane ever taller in that broad area. Most other large surface structures are built into the sides of mountains or dug down into the ground, as you suggested, though Swain's fortress, called Old House, same as his region, was built upward, being wedged between 2 mountain peaks, and in the same location as the massive castle of Vistria in the Fadelands. The sky seems to be easier to dislodge there. The process is the same, but over a smaller time scale, which has allowed his towers to be taller than most fell structures, though still much stronger than castle itself. The Eladrin of the Feywild, by contrast, are actually not so keen on huge structures. They build light structures in tall trees, like their elven cousins, and they like carefully arranged gardens, which include manufactured walls and sculptures to accentuate them. They're huge fans of structures which are open to the sky, allowing them to observe the weather patterns and the patterns of the stars. While elves have a big old palace, the Eladrin equivalent is more of a massive garden park with smaller substructures for privacy and protection from weather, but overall dominated by outdoor areas. The Formians, who have set up shop in the Feywild, in an area corresponding to large parts of Uruk, are used to living in vast underground tunnel networks. Their new home has precious few areas where they can dig more than short tunnels, fine for the low-ranked ants who tend to be small, but very few places they can hide a cavern large enough for the Queen or her Mirmarks. They have instead built mile upon mile of World War I-esque trenches, joined by a maze of tunnels in the 3 to 7 foot depth band, to give them the defense they naturally crave. In response, the Eladrin have built multiple coast-to-coast trenches instead of walls, because it's hard to monitor a wall for undermining, and relatively easy to patrol a trench on horseback looking for enemy breaches. But, like the inverse of Heidelag Castle, they have to keep digging out the bottom periodically to keep scraping the bottom of the world, which is a pain, because digging in the last foot takes a lot of energy. But they know that using many castings of stone shape, it's possible to create a tunnel as small as 8 inches high and wide, which is sturdy enough that you can walk over it without noticing, yet large enough for the smallest drones to squeeze through. And once you get any Formians past the trench, they can dig a large network of tunnels in the 6 to 7 foot depth band a lot faster than you would think. Xylem also asked, what happens if you try to dimension shift from the Underdark directly into the Feywild? Will the spell fail, or is this the equivalent of teleporting into a black hole? If you're trying to shift dimensions in a location that is invalid in the destination plane, like your example, the spell will just fail. Though, because of the various interplanar weirdness, there is the possibility, however remote, that you could find a space which does exist deep under the Feywild, or far above the Shadowfell. Obviously, as you get further from the normal parts of the plane, this becomes vanishingly unlikely. You just won't find a place a mile underground which exists in the Feywild, unless there's a very strong and weird reason. Xylem also asked, can you tell us about Feywild cosmology? Shadowfell has the Underdark, while Feywild has the infinite skies, right? So what's up there besides air? Floating islands? Cloud castles? Once you get high enough up, past where the air starts to run out in the Fadelands, the Fey sky has multiple strata, each massively larger than the stratum below it. There are said to be many strange lands up there, clouds made of unusual substances, or bound together by the root systems of magical plants. floating islands, colossal creatures, or even things that challenge the notion of what is alive. Remember those blue trees the party found in their brief Fey adventure? Thin, but hundreds of feet high, with leaves seemingly too large to support themselves. Those trees could grow so tall and hold up their leaves by siphoning some of the innate energy of the Fey. But that energy becomes more prevalent the higher you get, not less. Accumulating that energy, soaking it in, is thought to be what allows materials to maintain buoyancy or to otherwise levitate in the infinite sky. All manner of bizarreness supposedly exists up there, with different races who live on such islands, or who have various means of traveling between them, or of living on the winds themselves without ever settling down. But just to get above that first air layer, the one that touches the ground, requires you to find different means of rising, because traditional flight magic stalls out around the top of the lowest stratum. And finally, Big Grin asked, you mentioned that the players looked down and saw the lower bridge. Did they look up? Were there more bridges above, or just more impenetrable darkness? It looks like the brief mention of what was above them got cut from the final script. The chasm goes upwards around 100 to 150 feet from the upper bridge, but it narrows as it goes up, until it's basically just a crack. As far as they could tell, there was not much up there other than bats, but they didn't spend any time flying up and searching, so it's hard to know if they missed any other caves. I want to give a big thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons who get the extras videos about a week early, so I have a chance to answer their additional questions before the video goes out to everyone. Thanks so much for your continued support, with a special shout out, in no particular order, to Zombie, Aether Mordu, Big Grin, Fright Knight, Gorefiend, Pedrig of Rooney, Warsword, Duskmar, and Surf USA, the members of the organization. And if you don't feel like supporting my channel financially, I totally understand. But if you like it, please take a moment to share Tales from My D&D campaign on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you social your medias.